So before I became a law professor, I was an assistant federal public defender in Baltimore. And prior to that, I did community legal work in Baltimore. That was actually how I kind of met the criminal system, doing work in Baltimore neighborhoods and realizing how profoundly influential and destructive the criminal system could be in these low-income communities of color where so many people were affected. And that was where I met snitching. I met snitching in Baltimore when I was teaching in community centers and in church basements and working with community groups. And I realized that so many people in these neighborhoods and in these communities understood that there was a market, that the police were cutting deals with drug dealers, with criminals, and that there was a sense of unease and distrust that permeated these neighborhoods because you never really knew who might be working off their charges. And children would explain this to me. They would explain to me that drug dealers on the corner are snitching. Is that legal? Is that legal, Miss Sasha? Which is what everybody called me. Yeah. And I was shocked that from the outside, I like to think of myself as a relatively educated and well-informed person, and I had no idea how deep it ran in so many of these neighborhoods. And then, of course, when I became an assistant federal public defender and started working in the federal system, I saw how the legal system created, promoted, supported, subsidized, and made it in many ways the path of least resistance for the government, for defendants. And I became deeply interested in this sort of subterranean phenomenon that was so enormous but didn't get its fair share of attention at all. And so when I became a professor, I was determined to write about it and to air these problems. A lot of this happens in the shadows by design. The law is highly tolerant, criminal law is highly tolerant of the secrecy and the confidentiality, and therefore the lack of transparency and accountability that goes with that in the use of informants. For decades, the government has been telling us we can't use informants without secrecy, so you can't ask us. Right. And there are so many rules that have been around for decades that tolerate a kind of secrecy that we would never tolerate in other areas of public policy, even in areas of criminal law that affect so many lives, that affect so many cases. And we are just starting to see in the past 10 years some pushback from legislatures, pushback from the innocence movement, pushback from the criminal system to say, we need to know more. We can't let police be cutting deals on street corners without some kind of accountability. We can't tolerate prosecutors cutting deals with very serious offenders, whether they're drug dealers or, for that matter, hedge fund managers, without some understanding and accountability and transparency of how this part of the criminal system is being run.
Right. You've described it as a necessary evil. I mean, because law enforcement says there are cases we could never bring to light and prosecute and get the bad guys if we didn't use informants. But at the same time, there is a very dark side to the use of these informants.
So I'm going to tweak your sentence a little bit. Yeah. Law enforcement tells us that it is a necessary evil. I think of the use of criminal informants as an inevitable evil in our plea bargaining system. If you think of I think a helpful way to think about the informant deal is as a sort of radically deregulated plea bargain. And the vast majority of our criminal system runs on plea bargains. 95% of all the convictions in this country are the result of a deal, not of a trial. So we tolerate negotiation, we tolerate off-the-record deals in the very essence of how we run our criminal system. And so an inevitable part of that is that because we permit the deals, we permit law enforcement and prosecutors to negotiate and trade with defendants. So in that sense, the informant deal is a feature of the way we have decided to run our larger criminal system. But its pathologies are not inevitable. Its secrecy, the lack of accountability, the lack of transparency. So there are a number of key pathologies that flow from our decision, our public policy decision, essentially to run a market in the criminal system, to announce to every defendant, to every prosecutor, to every police officer that criminal guilt is negotiable, and that the government can trade anything that it wants, anything that it has to offer in exchange for information and cooperation. So perhaps the most high-profile dysfunction, of course, is unreliability, the wrongful conviction phenomenon, which we know so much more about than we did 15 years ago. There was a report from Northwestern University Law School that discovered that over 45% of all wrongful capital convictions, that is, all the innocent people who ended up on death row, were there because of a lying, compensated criminal informant. And the report concluded that that makes snitching the single largest source of wrongful capital conviction in the United States. That's a stunning revelation to realize that our errors in the capital context, in the arena of the most serious imposition of the most serious sentence, is so deeply infected by error because we rely so heavily on criminal informants. And so that, I think, has been really the leading recognized impetus for questioning, for resistance, and of course for legislative change and reform in this space. But unreliability is not the only dysfunction of criminal informant use. And to my mind, in many ways, the deeper pathology is that we have essentially commodified guilt. We have announced to every defendant, even to the most serious offenders who commit murder and rape and kidnapping and steal millions of dollars, that it's all negotiable. Right. And if you can find someone else to turn in, if you can find a way to be useful to the government, we will forgive you. Right. It is the universal loophole to American criminal law. And everyone from the drug informant on the corner who cuts a deal to avoid arrest with the police, to Jack Abramoff, who cut the corrupt lobbyist who cut a deal with the feds in order to avoid full punishment for his corruption. The entire spectrum of criminal activity and criminal process in this country is up for negotiation. And when I was a community-based lawyer in Baltimore and then as a public defender in Baltimore, I saw the kinds of erosion of trust in the criminal system that announcement created. Every child understood that crime was negotiable. That is a terrible message to send. And so, to me, it is that erosion, that the creation of this unprincipled market, that in many ways is the most troubling aspect of informant use. It results in wrongful convictions. It results in often police corruption. It results in the wrong people being charged and convicted or punished for the wrong things. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to the fact that we have established this deregulated, secretive, unprincipled market. The market for informant guilt, the trade that we permit between informants and the government for guilt and information and cooperation, has created this enormous zone in which the rules are essentially optional. And they're not only optional for the defendants, they're optional for the police, because we don't monitor, we don't demand accountability, we permit secrecy in all aspects of this market, which means police can get away with cutting corners, with breaking rules. Two of the perhaps most famous famous dysfunctions, particularly within the war on drugs, that we have seen are, one, the phantom informant In other words, the imaginary informant alleged by police that no one ever checks, that they can use to get a warrant, and then the unreliable informant who sets up innocent people or plants drugs, but the police rely on over and over again because they're productive, because they produce arrests, because they make the department or the officers look good. And we permit this through deregulation by saying we're not going to ask. We're not going to ask how you're running your informants. Magistrate judges, for the most part, do not demand that police produce the informant behind the warrant. So law enforcement knows that it would be very unusual to check. They had stopped a suspect on the street who had given them a tip, and they let him go in exchange for the tip. So the informant number one got to walk away because of the tip. They couldn't use that informant to get a warrant because he wasn't one of their registered informants, so they invented someone. They said a reliable, confidential informant who has worked for us before told us that he bought drugs at this address, although of course that wasn't true. They got a no-knock warrant for that address. They burst in, and Mrs. Katherine Johnson, who was 92 years old, 92-year-old grandmother, was there, and they shot her as part of the raid, and they killed her. And there were no drugs in the house. The original tip from the original informant was bad, and the police at that moment, in that moment of crisis, turned to yet a third informant, an informant they had used before, and offered him $130. His name is Alex White. They offered Alex White $130 to lie and say that he had bought drugs at that house so nobody would find out that they had invented a phantom informant to get the first warrant based on the bad tip from the original informant who they weren't supposed to use in the first place. And the reason I linger on the details of this story is that each step along the way, the chances of the police getting caught were very, very low. And if there hadn't been the tragedy, if Mrs. Johnston if they had not killed Mrs. Johnston, we would never know. If there had been anything in that house, we never would have known. And it is that culture of secrecy, that culture of lack of accountability that the law permits, that makes such terrible things possible. We keep finding stories like this. And I think that there is a growing realization that the reason that these stories are not on the record is not because they don't happen. It's because we haven't required transparency from law enforcement, and we have so few. I'll wait till that goes by. I think there's growing skepticism of the claim that these are one-offs, that these are bad apples, that these are exceptional, because every time we look under the rock, we find story after story after story. Since 2007, when that congressional hearing took place, there have been dozens of high-profile media investigations into these precise kinds of malfeasance and tragedy and cover-ups. So rather than accepting the claim that these are exceptional, we're starting to understand that this is predictable. It is predictable that when we give law enforcement carte blanche to operate in secret, to cut deals with suspects and criminal offenders and defendants without oversight and without transparency, that we can expect rule bending and rule breaking on all fronts. And then the second implicit claim, law enforcement claim, which is that you should leave us alone. That because you can't identify you can't identify enough tragedies, you should continue to give us carte blanche, and most importantly, you should not demand data. And that acceptance, I think, has profoundly changed over the last decade. We see state after state legislature saying, you know what, we want to know. We are not going to continue to trust the executive with this incredibly powerful and risky law enforcement tool, we want to know about the kinds of deals that you are making. We want to know about the kinds of crimes that you are tolerating from your informants. And all importantly, we want to know the benefits. In effect, law enforcement has been asking us for decades to just accept on faith that this is producing more social good than it is producing social harm. What would we mean by that? We would mean that the cases that they make, right, the cases that they solve are worth the costs of this terribly risky public policy. But they're not required to tell us. There is no law enforcement entity or official in this country that knows how many informants there are, how many crimes they solve, and how many crimes are tolerated by law enforcement, by the informants that they run. So I'm a hopeful person, and I would like to say that the ship is starting to turn. Connecticut, Illinois, Texas, California are almost half of all the states have either considered or passed legislation requiring prosecution offices to track their use of informants. This is a new phenomenon that grew up Tarrant County in Texas was one of the early movers in this space. The county decided, in the face of so many crises and so many wrongful convictions in Texas, that they were going to start to require their own law enforcement to keep track of the informants that they used. And we have seen jurisdiction after jurisdiction say, you know what, we need to know. So that veil of silence around the use of informants is starting to, I think, is starting to lift. You're absolutely right, though. In the main, it is still a highly secretive, unregulated space. And for the most part, we still tolerate law enforcement and prosecutors who say we can't tell you. It'll interfere with our ability to run informants if we have to disclose too much information. So I think we're at a crucial moment of public discourse where the public and legislatures are starting to say, we require disclosure for all kinds of sensitive and important public policies. Why not this one? You asked me why. Why is it that we're so tolerant of this kind of secrecy and lack of accountability? And I think there are many, many reasons. But I want to pinpoint one, which is that historically, the American criminal system and American criminal law and American constitutional law has traditionally been very, very deferential to law enforcement and to prosecutorial discretion. I mentioned a little while ago that our criminal system is mostly a matter of negotiation. We give extraordinary discretion and authority to law enforcement and to prosecutors to negotiate the millions and millions of cases that the American system produces every year. And that comes with a kind of deference. And I think the past 5 years have seen skepticism about that deference. From Ferguson, Missouri, to George Floyd, to the new wave of progressive prosecutors who have been winning elections in city after city after city. I think our public discourse is starting to recognize that while prosecutorial and law enforcement discretion is, of course, important, it shouldn't be a blank check.
How is this fighting crime at all?
So one of the pathologies of the informant market is that we don't actually know, on balance, whether using informants makes us safer or not. That is, of course, that's the claim. That the long-standing argument is that we need little fish to get the big fish. We need informants to investigate and prosecute crime, and it's worth it because it's producing more good than harm. And I'll just make two comments about that. One is, we do not demand data from law enforcement to show that that's at all the case. We have no idea how many crimes are solved by informants, and we have no idea how many crimes are committed by informants. In effect, we take it on faith that law enforcement tells us this is worth it. Yeah. Take our word for it. More specifically, we know that it doesn't always shake out that way. We know that police use big fish to round up a lot of little fish. They rely on high-level drug dealers to turn in low-level users, especially when police are incentivized to produce arrests. These are cheap. They tell us these are cheap and easy arrests. We know that informants with whom police and prosecutors cut deals sometimes turn out to be terribly dangerous people. And that law enforcement often turns a blind eye to the crimes committed by its own informants. So in effect, there's all this crime being tolerated in the name of fighting crime. It is the great irony of informant use. And until we actually know how many crimes are solved and the nature of those crimes, right? Not all crimes are equal. The high-level cartel member who turns in their lower-level operatives let me say that differently. Sure. But not all crimes are equal. We could have a public debate about whether it is worth it to let a hedge fund manager who stole millions of dollars and compromised millions of dollars worth of pension funds, to let them off, as we have seen happen time and time again, because they permitted us to uncover great fraud and corruption on Wall Street. Reasonable minds could differ as to whether that was worth it or not. Reasonable minds could differ over whether it was a good deal for America to let Jack Abramoff escape 30 years of punishment because he cooperated with federal authorities to uncover corruption on Capitol Hill. But we don't know. And so we can't have a democratic debate. We can't have a meaningful public policy argument about the costs and benefits of this great ironic deal that we are permitting law enforcement to cut because we do not require them to tell us. And that, to me, is the great, is one of it goes to the heart of one of the dysfunctions of the informant market, which is that we have no idea whether it's making things worse or making things better. We don't require data to be shared or public at many of the lowest echelons of investigation and law enforcement and prosecutorial decisions, in part because the law protects their discretion. And so as part of that discretion, the law says, well, you don't have to tell us until we get to trial. The American criminal system relies on the trial as the great moment of disclosure, not just to the defendant who is on trial, but to the public. Is one of the reasons that we have a right to a public trial, not only for the benefit of the defendant, but that so Americans can understand how it is the government is running the criminal system. And the problem is that in this day and age, we almost never go to trial.
Right, you said 95% of these cases end without a trial, so therefore they never have to answer to this, right?
Because our system has become essentially a system of plea bargaining, and one that rarely of litigation and rarely of trial, the cost of that is profound. It means that the great mechanism of transparency and accountability and disclosure almost never happens. And so we have to rethink, in effect, and that is what so much informant reform is today. It is rethinking how much disclosure we might require, even if there is no trial, because we realize that people are going to plead guilty. Even when there's corruption, even when they're innocent, the criminal system has enormous tools to put pressure on people to plead guilty, even when they're innocent. And those mechanisms turn out, not only are they unjust, and not only do they produce wrongful convictions, they're also mechanisms of secrecy. They keep all that secret, so we never learn when the guilty person pleads guilty that the informant planted drugs. We never learn when they cut a deal that the informant lied, or that maybe there was no informant at all. And so it really requires rethinking the mechanisms of accountability and disclosure that the criminal system, and in particular the Supreme Court, have relied on for decades as enough. The Supreme Court tells us that the adversarial process is sufficient to give us the information that we need. And in this day and time, it has become apparent that that is just not the case. This is the first time in the history of informant law that we are starting to hear these questions in the public discourse, in legislatures, and in courts to say, maybe it shouldn't be this easy. And the reason is because we now know more about the costs. We now know more about the dysfunction, but it was a little bit of a vicious circle.
Right.
When terrible things happened, we didn't know because we permitted it to be a secret. I'm going to wait. This is the first time we've really had the data and the awareness to push back against the fact that it is so easy. It is objectively deregulated. Our informant market is objectively secretive and deregulated. That's the status quo. We are now seeing pushback against that status quo, but the ship of American criminal law turns very, very slowly. And so you're right, the vast majority of police departments, of prosecutor offices remain unregulated. They remain unchecked from the outside. And that is the reality of so much of our criminal system, but I think that we are starting to think about this in a better way. So one of the reasons that the great ship of American criminal law turns so slowly is that, as we know, law enforcement in this country is not just a very powerful enforcement institution, but it's a very powerful political institution. And so there has been historic pushback to any kind of supervision, of interference, of transparency. So there was a city.
Okay. An American city.
And there was an American city, and this was a few years ago, and it came to the attention of the police brass that some of their officers were inventing informants. They were using phantom informants, and they were relying on unreliable informants, and there was a fear that there was abuse and malfeasance. And so the police supervisors went to their own rank and file and said, we want more information about how you're actually running these informants. And the rank and file went to their police union, and the police union sued their own department and got a restraining order to prevent the police supervisors from asking their own rank and file how they were cutting deals with criminals on the street and how they were using them to investigate cases. And I tell this story because I think it is emblematic of the culture of secrecy and the sense of entitlement in law enforcement to secrecy, and the idea that nobody else should be able to tell us how to run this part of our world. And eventually that case worked its way through the courts, and the court lifted the restraining order and said, yes, you need to tell your own bosses in the police department how you are engaging in criminal investigations. But the idea that the rank and file and the police union would have the sense of entitlement to get a court order to prevent having to disclose the nature of their own work to their own supervisors, I think captures this historic and traditional sense of entitlement to secrecy. It's what I call the culture of secrecy. It is deeply ingrained, it is old, and it is hard to dislodge. We don't know exactly how large the use of informants is because we don't require law enforcement to tell us, but we know it's pervasive, we know it's everywhere, we know it affects Every kind of case is subject to these negotiations. And so when they tell me that it's depressing, I say, yes, it is, but the ray of hope is that things are starting to change, that we are seeing reforms and public discourse that we did not see 10 years ago. 15 years ago, this was not on the public radar, and now it is. We are seeing reforms in the innocent space. We are seeing pushback against the kinds of things that lead to wrongful conviction. We are seeing significant pushback against the secrecy. State after state are starting to require tracking of informants through legislation so that at least the legislature can know how many informants are being used by prosecutors, and so the prosecutor's office can know. All too often, law enforcement and prosecutorial offices don't even know themselves how heavily they rely on informants because they don't keep track. And we have seen a profoundly important focus by the media on these questions. 10, 15 years ago, you'd be hard-pressed to see the media focus its attention deeply on some of these tragedies, some of these wrongful convictions, some of these stories of malfeasance. And now the media, I think, is doing a great service to do the thing that the criminal system should do. The criminal system should tell us itself how it works, and it doesn't. And so in many ways, the media has stepped up to uncover so many of these stories. And so the public, the American public, knows more today than it has ever known about the use of informants. And so I have to say, I am hopeful about the prospects for change going forward.